On my fourth day recovering from hip surgery, a nurse named Angela closed the curtain around my hospital bed, checked the hallway twice, and leaned in close enough that I could barely hear her over the sound of the monitor beside me. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I need to show you something in your chart, and I need you to understand I could lose my job for doing this. Your daughter signed something yesterday while you were still under sedation from the second procedure, and I don't think you know what it actually says."
I want to tell you exactly what was in that folder she slid onto my hospital tray, because it changed the entire course of what happened over the following 3 weeks, and it taught me something about my own daughter that I still have trouble fully accepting, even now. My name is Charles. I'm 75 years old, and this is the story of a hip fracture that nearly cost me my house, my independence, and my ability to ever make another decision about my own life again, and the nurse who risked her career to make sure that didn't happen.
If you've ever been vulnerable in a hospital bed, dependent on people you trusted completely, stay with me until the end, because this story goes somewhere I never expected, and I think it might change how you look at paperwork you're asked to sign during a medical crisis. And if stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe, because I have more of them to share. Let me take you back to where this actually started, not the hospital room. About 6 months earlier, when the first small signs of what was coming began to surface, quietly, the way these things always seem to.
My wife, Dolores, passed away 3 years ago. Congestive heart failure. Slow and difficult. 18 months of hospital visits and medication adjustments before her body finally gave out. After she died, I stayed in the house we'd lived in for 39 years. A modest 3-bedroom on a quiet street, paid off entirely, sitting on a piece of land that, according to a realtor who mopped on my door uninvited about a year after Dolores passed, had become worth considerably more than we ever imagined when we bought it in 1986, mostly because of a new highway interchange built 2 miles away that had quietly turned our sleepy neighborhood into something developers had started circling. I have one daughter, Melissa. She's 44 years old, divorced about 4 years ago from a marriage that, by her own account, left her considerably worse off financially than she'd expected. Legal fees, a settlement that favored her ex-husband more than she felt was fair, and a lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to during the marriage that had become considerably harder to maintain on her own income as a marketing consultant. I remember the years right after her divorce especially clearly, because I spent a good deal of that time simply trying to help her stay afloat emotionally, let alone financially. She'd call some evenings just to cry, sometimes about the marriage itself, sometimes about smaller humiliations that come with a life downsizing all at once. The townhouse she couldn't keep, the vacations she'd grown used to that were suddenly out of reach, friends from her old social circle who quietly drifted away once she was no longer part of a couple with a certain kind of income. I did what I could during those years, small things, covering a car repair here, helping with a security deposit there, never large enough to feel like a pattern, or so I told myself at the time. I want to be fair to Melissa, because fairness matters in a story like this one. After Dolores died, she was, in many ways, wonderful. She called often, visited most weekends, helped me sort through decades of Dolores's belongings in a process that took the better part of a year and that neither of us could have managed entirely alone. I was, and in many ways still am, deeply grateful for that support. But about 6 months before my hip fracture, I started noticing a shift in the kinds of conversations Melissa wanted to have with me.
It began innocuously enough. Questions about whether I'd thought about downsizing, whether the house felt like too much for one person to maintain, whether I'd considered what she called aging-in-place options versus something more manageable. I told her each time that I was perfectly happy where I was, that I could still handle the yard work and the upkeep, that the house held 4 decades of memories I wasn't ready to walk away from. Around that same time, Melissa began mentioning, with increasing frequency, a friend of hers who worked as a financial advisor, a man named Derek, who, according to Melissa, specialized in helping families navigate the complexities of aging parents' assets. I met Derek exactly once at a dinner Melissa arranged at a restaurant nicer than either of us usually chose, and I remember feeling a vague unease about him that I couldn't quite articulate at the time, a smoothness to his questions about my finances, my will, my current living arrangements, that felt less like genuine interest and more. He asked, at one point, almost offhandedly, whether I'd ever considered a reverse mortgage, framing it as a way to unlock some of the equity you're just sitting on without having to sell outright. I told him I wasn't interested, that Dolores and I had worked too hard paying that house off free and clear to ever consider mortgaging it again, in reverse or otherwise. And I remember the quick, practiced way he pivoted to a different topic, as though the question had simply been a card he was testing to see if it would play. I mentioned my unease to Melissa afterward, gently, and she brushed it off, telling me Derek was just naturally curious, that it was part of what made him good at his job. I let it go, the way I'd let a number of small things go over that 6-month period, each one small enough on its own to not seem worth the friction of raising it directly. I fell on a Tuesday morning in early March, on the back porch steps I'd walked down thousands of times over 39 years, carrying a mug of coffee out to watch the sunrise the way I'd done most mornings since Dolores passed, missing a step I'd navigated perfectly well the day before and every day prior to that. I remember the sound more than the pain initially, a sharp, wrong-sounding crack that I somehow understood, even in that first disoriented moment, meant something serious. I lay on that porch for almost 20 minutes before a neighbor, out walking her dog, heard me calling and came to help. I was diagnosed with a fractured hip requiring surgical repair, a procedure considered routine for my age, but requiring, given some complications with my blood pressure during the initial operation, a second follow-up procedure 3 days later. It was during the sedation for that second procedure, I would later learn, that a series of events unfolded that I had no memory of and no ability to consent to in any meaningful sense. Melissa arrived at the hospital within hours of my fall, appropriately worried, staying close throughout the initial surgery and the days that followed. I want to be clear that I don't believe, even now, that everything she did in those early days came from anything other than genuine concern. But somewhere in that first week, as I moved in and out of consciousness through 2 procedures and a fog of pain medication that made most of those days blur together into something I still can't fully reconstruct, something else was happening that I wasn't aware of at all. This is where Angela comes into the story. Angela had been my primary nurse for most of that hospital stay, the kind of nurse who remembers small details, that I preferred my water with extra ice, that I got anxious around certain medical equipment because of watching Dolores go through similar procedures years earlier, that I liked the curtains open during the day, even though most patients preferred them closed. She'd noticed, she told me later, that Melissa had a particular habit during her visits of positioning herself near the nurse's station whenever paperwork needed signing, requesting documents be brought to her rather than waiting for me to be fully alert and signing sections herself with what she described to hospital staff as power of attorney authority, though nobody had actually verified that such authority formally existed.
Angela told me later that what first caught her attention wasn't any single document, but a pattern of small behaviors over those first 3 days. Melissa consistently timing her requests to the nurse's station for right after medication rounds, when patients were typically at their most sedated and least likely to ask detailed questions about what they were being asked to review. Angela said she'd seen versions of this pattern before in her career, not always malicious, sometimes simply well-meaning family members trying to spare an exhausted parent the burden of paperwork. But she'd also seen it twice before in 15 years, connected to something far less well-meaning, and she'd learned to pay close attention whenever the timing lined up quite so consistently. On the 4th day, during a routine chart review, Angela noticed something that concerned her enough to break protocol. Buried among the standard post-surgical paperwork was a document titled Voluntary Transfer Authorization, a form indicating my consent, dated the previous afternoon, to be transferred upon discharge, not back to my own home, but to a long-term care facility across town, one Angela had never heard a single mention of during any of my actual conversations with hospital staff about discharge planning. The signature on the form was mine. I want you to understand what that means, because it's the detail that troubled Angela most. My actual signature on a document I had no memory of ever seeing or discussing, dated to a time when hospital records confirmed I had been under heavy sedation from the second procedure, barely able to hold a coherent conversation, let alone read and comprehend a legal transfer document. Angela did something that, by her own admission later, could have ended her career. She pulled the full chart, cross-referenced the timestamps, and found something even more troubling underneath the transfer authorization. A secondary document, this one a limited medical power of attorney, also dated to that same sedated window, granting Melissa expanded authority over not just medical decisions, but associated financial matters related to ongoing care. Language vague enough, Angela told me, that she'd seen it used before in her 15 years of nursing as a foothold for exactly the kind of situation she was worried I might be walking into. That's when she closed the curtain around my bed and showed me what she'd found. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it's more complicated than simple anger. I felt, first, a kind of vertigo. The specific disorientation of realizing that during a period when I'd been at my most vulnerable, unable to advocate for myself in any meaningful way, decisions had been made about my life and my body that I had no memory of consenting to. And then, underneath that vertigo, a slower, sadder realization about my own daughter, one I wasn't ready to fully accept yet. "I need you to understand," Angela said quietly. "I'm not accusing your daughter of anything with certainty. I don't know her intentions. But I know that a patient signing legal documents while under sedation, without a witness confirming genuine informed consent, is something that should never happen in this hospital, regardless of who's asking for it. And I know that this transfer authorization, if it goes through unchallenged, would move you to a facility before you've even had the chance to discuss your discharge options with your own care team." My voice came out smaller than I intended when I finally asked her what I should do. "Talk to the hospital's patient advocate," she said. "Today, if you can. And don't sign anything else without reading every word yourself, no matter how tired you are, no matter who's asking." My hands were shaking from a mixture of exhaustion, medication, and the slow, dawning realization of what I was actually looking at
when I asked Angela why she was risking her own job to show me this, sitting there in that hospital bed, still groggy from days of medication, and she said something I've never forgotten. "Mr. Reeves, I've been a nurse for 15 years. I've watched a lot of families at the worst moments of their lives, and most of the time what I see is love. Complicated and imperfect, but love. Every so often, though, I see something else, and I've decided a long time ago that staying quiet about that something else isn't a risk I'm willing to keep taking just to protect my own comfort." I asked her if this had happened before in her career, and she nodded, just once, and said only, "Not everyone gets the chance I'm giving you right now. I wasn't going to let that happen twice on my watch if I could help it." I met with the hospital's patient advocate, a calm, methodical woman named Renata, within 2 hours of that conversation with Angela. Renata confirmed what Angela had found and explained something that made the entire situation clearer and, honestly, more disturbing. Melissa's death. Melissa had apparently represented to hospital administrative staff during the chaos of an emergency admission that such authority already existed, and in the rush of that first day, nobody had thoroughly verified the claim before allowing certain paperwork to move forward. Renata helped me formally void both documents that same afternoon, flagging my chart to require any future paperwork to go through her office directly, with a mandatory waiting period ensuring I was fully alert and capable of genuine informed consent before signing anything at all. I spent the hours between that meeting with Renata and Melissa's usual evening visit rehearsing, in my head, at least a dozen different versions of what I might say, none of which felt adequate to the moment. I confronted Melissa that evening when she arrived for her usual visit. I want to tell you honestly that I didn't plan an elaborate confrontation. I simply asked her, directly, why there was a transfer authorization in my chart for a long-term care facility I'd never discussed with her, dated to a time I had no memory of being coherent enough to discuss anything. Her face went through several rapid changes. Surprise first, then something that looked like calculation, then, finally, a kind of defensive explanation that came out faster than I think she'd intended. "Dad, I was just trying to help. You were in so much pain, and the discharge coordinator mentioned that transitional care facilities often have better outcomes for hip fracture patients your age, and I just wanted to make sure we had options ready so you wouldn't have to make a rushed decision later. I never meant for it to seem like I was trying to force anything." "Melissa," I said, "the document says voluntary transfer authorization. It has my signature on it. I have no memory of signing it, and the hospital's own records show I was under heavy sedation at the time it's dated. That's not preparing options. That's obtaining consent from someone who wasn't capable of giving it." She didn't have an immediate answer to that. I asked her, more pointedly than I think I'd ever spoken to my own daughter in her entire adult life, about the power of attorney document, about Derek, about whether any of this connected to conversations she'd been having, quietly, about my house. I want to describe that first confrontation evening in a bit more detail, because it stretched on far longer than I initially expected, and it moved through several distinct stages I still think about. There was first about 20 minutes of Melissa insisting the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that hospital paperwork was confusing and she'd simply been trying to help navigate it. Then, when I pushed back with the specific timestamps Renata had provided, there was a stretch of silence. Melissa sitting in the chair beside my hospital bed with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at a spot on the floor rather than at me. And then, finally, something in her seemed to give way, the practiced explanation dissolving into something closer to the truth. That's when the fuller picture finally emerged, slowly, painfully, over the course of that evening, and several difficult conversations in the days that followed. Melissa, it turned out, had indeed been in ongoing conversations with Derek about my finances, not about managing them responsibly on my behalf, but about what she described, when finally pressed for full honesty, as exploring options for accessing equity in the house, given her own financial difficulties following her divorce. The plan, as it had apparently developed in her mind over recent months, involved my transfer to a
long-term care facility, funded initially through Medicare's post-surgical coverage, which would create a window during which the house could be listed and sold for my benefit, with Melissa managing the proceeds under the authority of that limited power of attorney she'd obtained during my sedation.
There was a long silence in that hospital room after she finally admitted the full plan out loud. Long enough that I could hear the hallway monitors beeping steadily beyond the curtain. Long enough that I had time to fully absorb what I was hearing before either of us spoke again. I want to be honest about how devastating that realization was. More devastating in some ways than the hip fracture itself. My own daughter, during one of the most vulnerable moments of my life, had seen not a father in pain who needed support, but an opportunity, however she might have rationalized it to herself, to solve her own financial difficulties using assets I had no intention of giving up. I want to tell you about the conversation with Renata in a bit more detail, because I think the way she handled it mattered as much as what she uncovered. She didn't react with shock or judgment, or even much visible emotion at all. I understand now that she'd likely seen versions of this situation more times than she'd probably like to count, and her calm was, in its own way, more reassuring than sympathy would have been. She walked me through exactly what the hospital's own internal review would need to establish: the timestamp of the sedation administered before the second procedure, the
timestamp on the signed documents, and a comparison against hospital policy regarding informed consent for patients under active sedation. Within an hour, the internal timeline confirmed what Angela had suspected. I had been given sedation at 11:40 that morning, and the transfer authorization was signed and notarized by a hospital notary at 12:15, 35 minutes later, well within the window the anesthesiologist's own notes described as impaired cognitive capacity expected for 4 to 6 hours post-administration. I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because the resolution here was neither simple nor entirely clean. I didn't press criminal charges, though. Renata and the hospital's legal counsel confirmed I would have had grounds to, given the documentation of sedation at the time of signing. I made that decision carefully, not out of naivety, but because I understood that criminal proceedings against my own daughter would likely end our relationship permanently, and I wasn't ready, even after everything, to make that particular choice. Friend, a retired judge named Harold Whitfield, no relation to anyone in this story beyond friendship, as my healthcare proxy, with Melissa explicitly and formally excluded from any financial decision-making authority going forward. I returned home, not to the long-term care facility, but to my own house, with in-home physical therapy and a part-time aide during the initial recovery period, a woman named Josephine, who came 3 mornings a week and who, within the first month, I'd come to genuinely look forward to seeing. Those first weeks home were slow, frustrating in the way recovery always is, relearning how to navigate my own kitchen with a walker, how to manage stairs I'd taken for granted for 39 years. But every difficult, halting step felt, in its own way, like a small act of reclaiming something that had nearly been taken from me entirely without my consent. Angela, I later learned, had faced some internal scrutiny for pulling my chart and initiating that conversation outside standard protocol,
though ultimately the hospital's ethics committee sided with her judgment, given what the investigation confirmed about the timing and circumstances of the signed documents. I made a point, once I was well enough, of writing a formal letter of commendation for her file, and I've stayed in touch with her since, in the informal way you sometimes stay connected to someone who changed the entire direction of your life during a period when you couldn't protect yourself. Melissa and I have spoken many times since that hospital stay, though spoken doesn't quite capture the difficulty of those conversations. She's expressed regret, genuine regret as far as I can tell, though regret complicated by continued financial pressure that I don't think has fully resolved on her end. I've helped her since, in smaller, more controlled ways, a modest loan for a specific expense, clearly documented, clearly bounded, but I no longer extend the kind of open, unquestioning trust I once did, and I don't think, honestly, that I ever will again in quite the same way. One conversation, about 4 months after everything, stands out to me more than the others. We were sitting on my back porch, the same steps where I'd fallen, which she'd insisted on having repaired with proper railings before I was even discharged, and she asked me quietly whether I thought she was a bad person. I told her the truth as I understood it, that I didn't think she was a bad person, but that I thought she'd let financial desperation convince her that a shortcut existed where none actually did, and that the version of help she'd tried to give me hadn't really been about me at all, not fully, not honestly. She cried for a while after that, and I let her, not saying much else, because I think some truths need room to simply sit in the air, rather than being immediately softened. I also learned in the months following that Derek had done something similar with at least one other client of his, an elderly widower in a neighboring town, whose family had, according to a brief mention in the local paper, filed a formal complaint with the State Financial Licensing Board. I don't know the full details of that other situation, and I've deliberately chosen not to dig into it further, but learning it existed at all confirmed something Angela had suggested to me in that hospital room, that what happened to me wasn't an isolated impulse, but part of a pattern Derek had likely. Well, families are vulnerable, each one in its own particular way. I think about Angela often, about the risks she took closing that curtain and showing me a folder she wasn't supposed to share, about the particular kind of courage it takes to jeopardize your own livelihood on behalf of a patient you've known for less than a week, simply because something in the paperwork didn't sit right with her. I think about how close I came to being moved into a facility I never chose, my house sold out from under me, all while unconscious for a procedure meant to help my hip heal. And I think, more than anything, about how vulnerability during a medical crisis can become an opening for people to make decisions about your life that you'd never consent to with your full mind intact, and how important it is, even now, at 75 years old, recovering and slower than I used to be, to read every single word of anything anyone asks me to sign, no matter how tired I am, no matter who's asking, no matter how much I love them. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever discovered during a vulnerable moment that someone you trusted was making decisions about your life without your real consent, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Melissa finally met with Harold Whitfield directly to discuss the boundaries around my care going forward, that's a story too. Let me know. One more thing before I close this out. About 2 months after I returned home, I ran into Renata by chance at a pharmacy near my house, and she mentioned that my case had actually led to a small but meaningful change in hospital policy. Patients now require a documented lucidity check, a short series of orientation questions confirmed by a second staff member, before any legal or financial paperwork can be signed following sedation of any kind. She told me it wasn't only because of what happened to me that similar concerns had been raised before, but that my case had been the one that
finally pushed the policy through committee review. I don't know why, but hearing that mattered to me almost as much as recovering my own independence did. Something good, at least, came out of those 3 days I still can't fully remember. Recovery, it turns out, was never really only about my hip. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.